Well, I've been joined here by a team of, shall I say, some eminence in the field of motoring, starting with the recently appointed Minister for Transport, John Gilbert MP, and from British Leyland, their Director of Sales and Marketing, Mr. Keith Hopkins, from the RAC, their Policy Executive and the member of the Standing Joint Committee of the Motoring Organisations, Tony Lee, and finally down there at that end, a Director of the British School of Motoring, Jeremy Barrett. Let me put this general point to you to begin with, gentlemen. A lot of people are getting the feeling now that manufacturers, governments and others are very happy for us to buy motor cars, but not entirely happy about us actually using them. Therefore, is there a future for the private car, and if there is, what is it? Minister?
Well, people are always going to want the convenience and the freedom that personal transport, as represented by a car, will bring them. There's no question about that. The problem, of course, is that in addition to its great liberating features, the car can be a very lethal weapon. It can be dirty, it can be noisy, and it can be very greedy in its consumption of very scarce resources, and you have to get a balance between the two.
So you see the future as a balance?
Has to be. All
right. Keith Hopkins, would you agree with that analysis?
Yes, I think I would agree with what the Minister says. I was glad to hear him say that he regards the private motor car as a liberator. I would go further. I would have thought it was the most socially liberating influence of the 20th century. Let's face it, 100 years ago, if somebody lived in Lancashire and their father lived in London, he never ever saw them. The motor car has given enormous freedom to the private individual. And I think what we have to do the next few years is to come to terms with these problems that the Minister mentioned, noise, pollution and congestion and so on. And I think over the next few years you will see that happening. It's happened already. Cars don't pollute the atmosphere quite so much as they used to. They're much safer to drive. They're much more manoeuvrable in traffic and so on. And I would like to see us attacking the problem from that point of view. Let's come to terms with the motor car. Don't let's punish it too much.
And refine what we already have, perhaps.
That's right.
Jeremy Barrett, what's your view of the future, if there is one?
The very great agreement with what has been said, except that I think we need to refine the driver, the person that points this very lethal weapon. It is a shame that a driving license is considered to be a right and not a privilege. I disagree very strongly with what the Minister has recently done in making driving licenses for life available, because it makes it even more of a right rather than a privilege. Once somebody has a driving license, say, right, that's it, finished.
I see. Tony Lee, I think, wasn't it the Duke of Wellington who sarcastically commented years ago that railways were a bad idea because they encourage the lower classes to move around? You represent the motorist. Everyone's talked about congestion. Is the future, as you see it, from the point of view of a motorist champion, one eternal traffic jam?
We hope not. We hope that the Minister and his colleagues will help to avoid this situation, but you have referred to the various classes, and I think the point now is that the motor car is owned by people in all classes. Everyone is either a motorist now or will be in the years ahead, and we're anxious to dispel the anti-motoring propaganda which comes forward from time to time, and to get a realistic and progressive approach to the future. We certainly think that the motor car has a great future. We're glad that the Minister is a keen motorist and recognises the social advantages of motoring, but also, of course, motoring is vitally important to the country's economy.
Right, well, there's a general roundup, in which case let's go back to the Minister and ask him what the government's transport policy is. Briefly, please.
Well, that of course is a huge question, which ranges much wider than the roads and the motor car, and involves questions of the docks and so on, which you wouldn't want me to talk about now. But my general policy is to try to make British roads safer to drive on, which also involves making British drivers safer, to make the cars that people drive in safer and sweeter to the environment, and to take as much aggravation as possible out of driving for the safe, competent, efficient motorist. I may say I think I ought to take issue with Mr. Lee on just one point, where while I am firmly convinced of the role of private motoring in the future, I think it's possibly an exaggeration to say that everybody is going to be a motorist in the future, because even in the richest countries this is not the case. And we must have a firm role for public transport. And the man who commutes into a city centre using a great deal of road space and petroleum products just to drive himself in and out is actually performing an antisocial act.
If I can just put some words into Tony Lee's mouth, I don't think he was entirely saying that. Weren't you saying, Tony, that everyone ought to have a right to be a motorist in the future?
Well, certainly we believe that public transport has a vitally important part to play in the transport system, but what we are anxious to have is a reasonable balance between the planning for use of both public and private transport. Obviously there will always be some people who may be physically unfit to drive motor vehicles or for other reasons will be unable to have cars, but the vast majority of people with improvements in the quality of life will always be anxious to have the benefits of personal mobility. This is not just in this country, this is throughout the world this is happening.
It's the privilege, not the right.
Well, there we are. There's a nice semantic argument coming up.
Right.
Let's see for a moment if there's not a conflict of interest here on another level. We've seen a lot of traffic schemes coming into force in urban areas. It's becoming increasingly difficult to bring a car into central London and to park it. All of which is, to some extent, at the feet of those who rule us. But those who rule us, Minister, also now make motor cars. Aren't you in danger of drumming up a conflict of interest here?
Well, first of all, the traffic management schemes are very much local authority determined. I should make that clear, but local authorities up and down the country have decided that a certain degree of congestion in the road system passes tolerable limits, particularly at peak hours. And it is also impossible to run an efficient public transport system if people do insist on private transport for journeys of that sort. And they have a duty to the less well-off members of the community. People with school children have to go certain journeys, people getting to work, to provide an adequate public transport service for the basic travel of getting to and from your job, to and from school.
Well, all right, let's fly another kite then. A lot of people, when asked about their attitude to using public transport and not taking their cars to work or wherever, are perfectly happy to say, yes, I'd love to use it, give me a decent public transport system. Is what you're saying that all motorists should give 5 years for Britain while the Department of the Environment sorts out the railways and the underground system so that it can cope?
Now, what I'm saying is that we as a society have got to decide to make a substantial investment in running a proper public transport system. It's a chicken and egg situation very much. You have so many cars, it takes ridership away from the public transport system, and it's very difficult to get people back into public transport, and this is one of the problems we face as a community. It's not just a government problem, it's a problem for the whole of society.
What about a problem for the manufacturer then? Because, Keith Hopkins, there seems to be some evidence that the traffic scheme that was adopted in Nottingham, the collar scheme I think it is, has actually resulted in a fall-off in car sales.
Oh, I see, yes. Well, I think that was only an experiment. Obviously, as British Leyland, we have a great interest in public transport anyway because we manufacture the vast majority of buses in this country. And I agree with the Minister that we do have to plan to avoid congestion in cities. But I do think that we have to also plan for the future and recognise that whereas there are roughly 15 million motor cars on the road at the moment, we are projecting that there are going to be something like 25 million in 10 years' time. So I think we ought to invest in some very imaginative traffic schemes to cope with those motor cars. We'll play our part. We'll make the cars safer. We'll make them pollute the atmosphere less, both by exhaust emission and by noise. But I do think we ought to think ahead that far.
Well, thinking ahead that far, do you feel that our urban traffic problems are best going to be solved by changing the nature of the city, as has happened, for instance, in the centre of Birmingham, or by changing the habits of motorists, as the GLC Transport Committee would love motorists to do, by not bringing their cars? Which way is it going to go?
I think the motorists will accept either, quite frankly. I don't think we want to have one rigid blueprint for the whole of Great Britain. Obviously, the plan must be flexible and capable of interpretation for individual areas.
Jeremy, how do you see the traffic city of the future, perhaps?
I feel it's not so much the city, it's the bodies. Obviously the city has to comply within certain limits, but I think a balance has to be struck between business travel and leisure travel. And I think in the future, private motoring and the ownership of private motor cars should be, and I'm sure will be, more geared to leisure motoring and weekend motoring and evening motoring, if you like, whereas it will become, I hope, a matter of course that on your way to business, going to work, you will use public transport. And I think a balance in that area could solve a great many of the problems that we have around the country.
Tony Lee, do you endorse that?
Not entirely, because I think we must remember to start with that a high proportion of people already travel by public transport where it is practicable to use it to go to work. But when we look ahead, it is really unrealistic to think of excessive restriction of the use of private transport, because quite apart from the economic importance of the motor industry to the country, we've got to recognise that the people will want to use their cars to the maximum advantage. And I go back to the excellent report many years ago by Professor Buchanan on traffic in towns, and it was emphasised in that report that we cannot go on and on producing more and more motor vehicles unless we're prepared to plan to accommodate them. And 90% of people and goods are carried by road transport and private transport, and I think that this is something that we've got to allow for in our future planning.
John Gilbert, isn't the answer to that merely to spend the money that you raise from motoring on the roads?
Well, could I just say, I agree very much with what Jeremy Barrett's just said about getting the balance between private and leisure use of a car and the business use of the car. The problem, of course, is that while the private individual quite rightly seeks to get the maximum benefit out of his personal investment in the car, the consequence of all of us doing that can be a very serious cost to the community as a whole. Now, the question of what proportion of transport money you put into the railway system, which is still vital. I mean, so be it, a very great proportion of our freight is moved by road now, an increasing proportion, but we cannot do without a railway system, obviously. And as soon as any suggestion that there's a railway strike, clearly it has the most serious repercussions for British industry as a whole. It makes it impossible for British Leyland to go on making cars, amongst other things. So there can be no question of switching resources in a massive way from investment in other types of transport infrastructure to the roads. But we must have an ongoing road program, and we've still got a long way to go before we've got a completed motorway network in this country, for example.
One interesting aspect, actually, every time there is talk of a railway strike or a bus strike or whatever, we always prepare ourselves for a further influx of people coming to us to learn to drive. I mean, you can almost count, like you open the doors half an hour earlier if there's a thing in the papers that the buses are going to be out that day.
Well, you've mentioned learning to drive. Now, the driving test has remained largely unchanged since 1934. One prediction says there will be 20 million plus vehicles on our roads by the end of this century. What's wrong, Jeremy Barrett, with the present driving test?
The driving test has, as you say, remained basically unchanged for a long time. It has got a great deal more difficult due to road conditions, road furniture, increased traffic, and so on and so forth. The Minister recently mentioned some ideas, a bit of kite flying, ministerial kite flying, on changes that might be brought in, such as teaching people to park. Because, of course, in 1935, when you wanted to stop the car, you pulled into the side of the road, and that's become a weeny bit difficult around most of our towns nowadays. The failure rate of the driving test is higher than it has ever been. But nevertheless, I would like to see the test made more difficult. It may well become longer, one of the proposals that the Minister has mentioned, and I think this is all to the good. I think our driving test, with the exception of New York, is possibly one of the simplest driving tests in the world.
All right. Now, are you going to fly that kite a little bit higher and endorse those proposals, or what?
Well, we shall be going out to consultation with the responsible bodies like the RAC and the AA and the driving schools with a whole lot of proposals for making the driving test tougher. And we shall see what the response from those responsible bodies is. It will cover things like possibly some minimal knowledge of the mechanics of a car. It may cover various other manoeuvres that aren't covered at the moment. Some of the things that I would dearly like to do are unfortunately not practicable. For example, there's a lot to be said for seeing that people pass a test they can drive at night or they can drive on a motorway, but these things are unfortunately impractical to introduce all over the country because there are no motorways in Wales to speak of, and in the north of Scotland for many months of the year it's almost perpetual daylight.
I think there's quite a lot actually that the motor manufacturer can do to make driving safer and easier. And I think we shall see over the next few years, for example, a greater use of power steering and automatic transmissions, which previously you've only seen on expensive cars. These sort of things are now being refined so that you'll see them on the family car, I think.
That's good to
and,
hear.
for people who've tried to learn to change gear, I think that'd
Be a
be a very
considerable advantage.
Yes,
Yes.
and
It
should that
doesn't
be?
actually make driving any safer. It may make it more simple.
Can we not get into that one just for the moment? Because I just have time for one last question, which is more or less a yes or no answer for the Minister, and it is this. By this time next year, will we see the end of the fuel-saving 50 and 60 mile an hour limits? Will we see the fact that we have to wear seatbelts by law? And will we be obliged to drive everywhere at night on dipped headlights, and indeed perhaps even during the day with lights on?
Well, can't give yes or no to all those because they're different answers.
Try.
On the speed limits, well, that decision has to be taken before the end of November, and I don't think I could say anything to anticipate that. On dipped headlights, as you know, I'm very much in favour of having dipped headlights in towns, as is necessary now on the less well-lit streets and as is necessary in country areas. In fact, I know it's somewhat controversial, but people complain of the dazzle they think will come about. Well, other countries don't suffer from this. And you're much more likely to be dazzled where you've got headlights coming towards you, where there are no other lights around. You're least likely to be dazzled on a well-lit town street. On the other hand, it's much more difficult in those circumstances to see a car coming towards you on side lights.
What about seatbelts?
Well, that's for Parliament to decide. I hope very much that we will have compulsory seatbelts. I can think of no better, quicker way of saving lives and reducing injuries when accidents have occurred than making people wear seatbelts.
Minister, gentlemen, thank you all very much indeed for joining us.